I wonder if you've ever made an amazing cake or dessert and you were so happy with what you had produced. You were really chuffed with it. Maybe you even took a photo of it, and perhaps if you're social media savvy, you put it on one of those platforms. But after you'd done that, what did you do with this amazing cake? Did you just sit there and admire it? I imagine that you probably ate it, and most likely you shared it with some other people because you want them to enjoy your cooking as well. If I do say so myself, I make, I think, a pretty amazing fruit cake because I love fruit cake. And I also love sharing this particular fruit cake because I've found over the years that when people have it, they seem to enjoy it, and they often comment on how nice it is. You know, I'm sure you've heard the old saying that says, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. And that idea is kind of what we find in today's passage from Paul's letter to the Philippians. As we continue our series through this letter, we're into chapter 2 today. And let me read to you the first 4 verses. The Apostle Paul says this: "Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others." If I was to paraphrase this passage in pudding terms, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, I imagine Paul might be saying something like this: we have a great recipe with all the best ingredients for an amazing cake. Dare I say it, an amazing grace cake. But, Paul would say, it needs all of us to cook together so that others can taste the goodness of God. So let's think about these words using that kind of imagery. Let's think about, first of all, the ingredients that Paul talks about in this passage. Let's dig deeper into verse 1, where Paul says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion. Now, what Paul is saying here, using that word if, it sounds like he's not certain about whether the Philippians have these things he's talking about. It sounds like he's questioning. But what he's actually doing is using this as a rhetorical tool to help the Philippians recall what they know to be true, to reflect on what they know to be true. Paul, we need to remember, is writing this letter not to an individual or to separate people. The letter's not going to be circulated to every individual Christian. He's writing this to a whole church. And most likely the letter was probably read aloud in a congregational gathering. And so the Philippian Christians will have heard Paul's words through the filter of their community experience, not their individual experience. They will have been thinking about these words in terms of what it means for them as a whole church family, not just individual Christians. And so as Paul's writing this first verse, as he's saying, if you have any of these things, he's actually expecting the Philippians, as they hear this, to be nodding their heads in agreement together and saying, yes, we have all of these things. Now, I wonder whether we as a church, at Craigie Baptist Church, whether those of us who are a part of that church would also be nodding together, saying, yes, we have all these things as a church family together. Now, obviously, some of these ingredients can be experienced and should be experienced individually, such as encouragement and comfort. But there is one that cannot be experienced on your own, and that is this idea of common sharing in the Spirit. Common sharing in the Spirit. The phrase common sharing is actually the Greek word koinonia, or fellowship. And we looked at this about 4 weeks ago because we saw it in chapter 1, verse 5, where we discovered that this word has at the kind of core of it this idea of partnership, of working together, of active participation in something together. And so Paul says in chapter 1, verse 4 and 5, he talks about, he prays with joy because of the partnership that the Philippians have in the gospel with him. They have a partnership in the gospel. It's the same word. Here it's translated in chapter 2 as common sharing. Now, what Paul is addressing here in this particular passage, these 4 verses of chapter 2, is something he's really passionate about. And that is unity. Paul, as we discover through his letters, is very passionate about church unity. Why? Well, I think one key reason is because he had seen the devastation that could be caused by disunity. He had seen the devastation of disunity. For example, the church at Corinth was torn apart by factions. You can read about that actually in Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians. The church was torn apart by factions. At Philippi, it seems that disunity is not really a problem, although in chapter 4 we see that there's 2 ladies that are not quite getting on. Paul says, chapter 4, verse 2, I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. So there's obviously something going on between these 2 ladies. And Paul, I think, addresses the unity thing in chapter 2 because he was aware of this thing between these 2 ladies, and he knew that personal issues, personal disagreements have the potential to escalate into church disunity because people tend to take sides, and before we know it, the church divides. But Paul also knew how important church unity is to the message of the gospel, the good news about Jesus. Because unity is not just a way to keep the peace between people. It's not just a way to sort of make sure everyone's nice and happy and no one's getting upset. It's actually how Christians demonstrate the gospel to the world around them. And Paul knew that because of what Jesus said and what Jesus prayed for us in what's known as his high priestly prayer in John chapter 17, where he prays for his disciples who are with him. And then he goes on to say in John 17, verse 20, my prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one. I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. You see how important church unity is for the sake of the gospel, for the message that we are sharing with the world? Now, can I say that I think a real practical demonstration of this kind of unity is something that's been happening with our church in recent months, and that is our partnership with Cross Culture Church. And I just think this is a wonderful example of how we can express unity to our local community by having another church fellowship, a different flavour of worship and expression of the church, working together with us in our facility, in partnership, not just tenants, but partners. This is unity across denominations, across whatever labels that we like to put on ourselves. And so can I say to those of you who are part of Craigie Baptist Church, well done. Well done for allowing this and nurturing this partnership. You know, Psalm 34 verse 8 says this: taste and see that the Lord is good. It's a wonderful invitation. And unity, I believe, gives people a taste of God's goodness. Unity is the way that we can say, hey, people, come and taste and see that the Lord is good, because we're together and we love each other and we've experienced God's goodness to us. So Paul knew that the church has the best ingredients to bake an amazing grace cake. Ingredients like comfort and encouragement and compassion and tenderness that is identified here in verse 1. But they will only taste the way they should taste when we bake them together, when we follow the recipe. And so we're going to look at the recipe just now as we move into the next few verses. But first, I would like you to reflect on this video clip.